All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Gayle Laakmann McDowell, and I'm going to talk about how to do Google kind of style questions, but hopefully better than actually them because they make a lot of mistakes. I'm going to talk mostly today about the kind of problem-solving algorithm questions, but I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning about kind of knowledge questions because it's a quick topic to kind of get out of the way, and it's something that a lot of interviewers make mistakes on. So for a little bit of context about my background, if you haven't been to one of my earlier talks today, which I know many of you already were there, my background is as a software engineer. I was at Google for a while on the hiring committee as an engineer and did a ton of interviewing there, and then wrote Cracking the Coding interview and Cracking the PM interview. And what I do now, though, is a lot of consulting. So that's actually on both sides. So I do acquisition interview coaching, which is basically when startups are in the acquisition process with bigger companies. They often go through interviews, more or less interviewing for their own jobs. So I get brought in by startups to help prepare their engineers and PMs and other roles for those interviews. And then I also do the other side and help companies on how to structure the hiring process to get consistency across the company, try to get better candidate experiences, better qualified candidates, move through the process more quickly, have teams trust each other and not go say this other team actually sucks, things like that. And they're actually, it's interesting because the things are, although they're opposites, are also kind of complementary in a lot of ways in that a lot of the stuff I do to help prep candidates, if there's a question or type of question which I can prep candidates on really effectively, that's actually a signal to the other side that you shouldn't be asking those kind of questions because it's all about preparation, right? And vice versa. So they're kind of complementary, although they're also kind of polar opposites. Okay, but today what I'm going to talk about is mostly, a little bit of knowledge, mostly problem-solving questions. Slides are online. This link should hopefully work. If not, it'll work within a few hours when I fix it. So go to gayle.com/interviewing-like-Google. Okay, with that, now that I'll let you guys quickly take pictures of the slide. Looking good. Okay, so first I want to talk about core philosophy around hiring. So first, hire people who are smart. Intelligence matters, right? You can argue about what, how intelligent, what kind of intelligence, blah, 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 but in fact, pretty much across lots and lots of professions, but especially software developers, intelligence matters. It helps. It's not everything, no, but it is certainly a very good thing to have in a person. We want to keep candidates happy. If you do things that make candidates unhappy, your great candidates don't actually accept your offer. So it doesn't really matter that much that they were so great because they're not going to go take your offer. But also, even the candidates who are not so good, they might be good in the future, but also they might just go and write that nasty Medium post about their awful experience interviewing for that company. And a few of those articles come out, and it's a hard reputation to shake. So it's really, really important to keep candidates happy. The other piece that a lot of interviewers and companies don't think about is that the things that make candidates unhappy about the process are also things that are making them do worse. So when they have interviewers who ask them questions that they feel are unfair, that they don't feel like they got adequate preparation for, that they feel like their interviewer just wasn't nice, these are things that are going to make the candidates perform worse and actually going to make it harder for you to understand how good they are. So it's really, really important to keep candidates happy. Signal. I'm going to talk about this again and again today. Interviewing is about two things, candidate experience, but also signal. That is the way we should be thinking about questions, the candidate's performance. It's not, was this a good answer or not? When you ask them how they would, how they tackled the situation, was that a good way of handling it? That's not the question you should be asking. What you should be asking yourself is, what signal did you learn about the candidate from there? Did you learn that they are a risk taker? Did you learn that they are data-driven? Did you learn that they have a lot of empathy for users, a lot of empathy for customers or fellow employees, or that they don't? That is what you should be asking at every question, is what is the signal you got from the candidate? Corollary to that, it is on you to get that signal. A lot of times interviewers will look at the candidate's answer and be like, well, I asked the candidate about a hard challenge. It didn't seem like the challenge was very hard, so I'm going to assume that the challenge actually wasn't very hard. Maybe, or the candidate just isn't a great interviewee, which doesn't mean they're not a great employee. They just aren't good at the art of interviewing. It's your responsibility to follow up and really drill in and figure out what was the challenge? or direct this or that about the process. So that is your responsibility as the interviewer to get that signal. And then we're looking for people who are good in the long run, not in the short term. What exactly that means depends on the company and how long can you justify training people. But we're usually talking about 6-ish months in to a job. Sometimes less, sometimes more, but it's not, would they be good in week 1? So a lot of people have this idea. I've had countless conversations with people about how to interview. People are like, well, the best thing to do is to give a real work sample. And that is a great way to figure out how good they're going to be in the first week. That's a different question than is that predictive of how they are 6 months in. People, as a trivial example of this, if you gave people a very homework style, very relevant project that they had to do in Java and they didn't know Java, they're going to suck at it. Doesn't mean in 6 months they couldn't be great working for your company doing Java, right? So you're looking long run. Okay, so with that said, with those kind of philosophy in mind, let's go into talking about the actual process. So we're going to talk about, there's a couple different types of questions. Because I only have an hour today, I'm not going to talk about behavioral or design questions or come to some of these like collaboration exercises. What I'm going to talk about is knowledge and then problem solving. With all of these types of questions, there's overlap. There are lots of design questions or problem solving questions that also get at their knowledge on things. And there is collaboration exercises, so that's like pair programming, things like that. That certainly gets at problem solving as well, or design. There's a lot of overlap between these, and that's actually a really good thing because it means that when you do multiple types of questions, which you probably will in any process, you have different interviewers getting, kind of confirming different data points. So it's a good thing that there's overlap. But today, let's start with knowledge questions. So I'm going to talk about this quickly because it is something I can get out pretty quickly, and it's something that is a really, really common error people make with knowledge questions. So knowledge questions are anything that's kind of language trivia. It's, what does this keyword mean in Java? What happens when you execute this kind of command? It's any of those kind of questions. So suppose a candidate doesn't know the answer to the question. So what? What does that matter? And that's a general question. Why does it matter that someone knows something or doesn't understand that? So let's talk about what that is. Knowledge matters. Knowledge about a language or some technology, something like that, it matters in 2 cases. One, if it's hard to acquire that knowledge, or if it's a red flag that the person lacked that bit of knowledge. So you ask someone what some keyword means in Java or Python, or some question about some detail of the language. I see a lot of times when interviewers assess someone's skills in some language by asking pretty basic questions about that language. So for example, one company I was consulting with, I looked at their interview questions, and these were for people just out of college, or actually currently in college applying for new grad positions. And they're asking these people questions about, what's the difference between an inner join and outer join in SQL. And I looked, I asked them, well, why do you need to know this? Why are you asking this question? Well, we do a lot of databases. Okay, great. But why does the candidate need to know that? Does it matter if the candidate knows the difference between inner join and outer join? If it's a candidate who's very experienced with databases and they don't know that, okay, that's a red flag, sure. But these are candidates in college. Some of them have database experience, some of them don't, because some took the database classes and some didn't. The candidates who didn't take the databases class may not know that stuff, but does it matter? Is it really hard to learn that stuff? Because I'm pretty sure if someone does 2 weeks of SQL and they're going to know the answers to this kind of stuff. All the company has done is rule out the candidates who don't have those 2 weeks of SQL knowledge. And that's just cutting down your pool. You're not getting worse candidates or better candidates, but you're cutting down your pool of candidates a lot. If they want database experts, and if they want just basic knowledge of databases, they shouldn't want that. Because just train people on that. If you just want basic knowledge, just train people. You don't need to hire on that. If you want an expert knowledge of databases, one, you're not hiring new grads. You're hiring much more experienced people. And then you better be assessing them as experts. Taking a cursory example of their knowledge on basic stuff, like that's not helping you or them. So remember that with your knowledge questions. And when you go back and talk to teammates, they should be asking, generally speaking, if you're assessing knowledge of a language, you're assessing it deeply. Or if you're doing just a cursory knowledge, it's basically a red flag check. Did this candidate lie when they said that they knew databases? You're not actually caring that much if they know it or not. It's just a check of honesty. But if you're going to do these, the best way to go about knowledge questions, ask questions that are more open-ended. When it's a simple factual questions and there's a bunch of them, it starts to feel like the candidate's getting grilled, and it doesn't make them feel very good about the process. So you want to ask more open-ended questions, and then you can actually get a lot deeper. And you can test the person's, not just has the person studied a bunch of interview questions on SQL or whatever, but can the candidate actually apply that knowledge and apply the concepts? And that's where you can get more effective, a better signal there. So my favorite questions on these are just, how does this thing work? And you can start digging into the details. Explain to me how this would be implemented. Teach me about this topic. It's okay to ask a few simple factual questions that are, essentially could be judged right or wrong. But the bulk of it, if you're going to be doing this, you're looking for experts, hopefully, and then you should be asking it as a much deeper conversation. All right. So that's just quick stuff on knowledge questions, or that I told you that'd be very, very quick, so I could spend a bunch of time on these kind of algorithm problem-solving questions. So I'm going to start off with a few scenarios. So let's start off with this. You're asking some kind of design algorithm question, the candidate's coding. They're pretty nervous, make a bunch of mistakes, much more so than a normal candidate. And then later on, they kind of relax and they fix their mistakes. So they did struggle on the coding question. Is that a concern? No, right? Yes, they struggled. That is literally what happened. But what signal did you get? What signal you got is that they're nervous. Well, that's fine. That's normal. And then the other signal they got was, ultimately, at the end of the day, they were able to, once they got past their nervousness, they're a good coder. So it doesn't matter that they struggled. That's not the point. The question is, what signal did you get? The signal you actually got was that they're a good coder. That's what matters. Another scenario. So you ask a candidate a question, they misunderstand it, and they end up being on the wrong track for 10 minutes or so. And as a result, they essentially have lost time in the interview, so they don't have enough time to complete the problem. What do you do with this? What signal are you getting? How should you be responding to this situation? Yeah, you first, so there's lots of different things here. One is, what on earth was happening that the candidate was on the wrong track for 10 minutes, misunderstanding the problem, and you didn't do anything about that? More often than not, that was probably your fault for not paying enough attention. Not always. Maybe the candidate communicated in a really poor way, maybe this or that, maybe you're trying to reroute them, but there's an issue here potentially with your interviewing skills. Hey, everyone makes mistakes, that's fine, but there's an issue potentially. But if we peel back a layer, we start talking about signal. So there's many interviewers who say the candidate didn't finish the problem. That's, but the good candidates do, so that's a problem. Well, that's not fair. They got less time. When it comes to the problem-solving signal specifically, you have to adjust for the fact that they got 10 minutes less time, because that's not a reflection of problem-solving signal. That you have to adjust for that. So them not having enough time to complete the problem when other candidates do is potentially very reasonable because they had less time. Problem-solving signal should not be, or you need to adjust for that. There's other signal here, which is a signal on your own skills as an interviewer, yes, but also a signal on something around communication or understanding. Maybe the candidate misunderstood the problem because they were nervous and they just were thinking about how nervous they are and just wasn't paying enough attention. And it's not really a problem that they misunderstood the question. That absolutely happens. There's also a chance that this is the kind of candidate who just misunderstands a lot of things, and that it manifested this in your interview this way, and then the next person's interview, what they're going to see is that this candidate made a lot of incorrect assumptions. And the next interview, they see something else. And we actually have, it's not a random one-off that they were nervous. There's actually a trend. So these are all different signals. It's not did they do well, did they do poorly. It's from a problem-solving perspective, maybe they did very well. But there's this other signal you have here around maybe there's some communication problems or the way that they understand, problems around how they understand things. You want to put that down in, if you have written feedback, you want to put that down in the feedback, because you want to know when somebody else, if everybody operates on the mindset of, they were just nervous, it probably wasn't a big deal, I'm just going to ignore that this happened, then you'd never realize that everybody's manifesting, everyone's seeing the same problem manifest in different ways. So think about these different signals you're getting and separate them out. You can separate them out, but note what is going on here, what might be going on here. Very often in interviews, you don't have clear-cut things where this is clearly a signal of this. It's just, hey, we're shifting our probability that maybe there's a probability now, that a little bit higher probability that they have problems understanding stuff. And that's something you want to, if it's consistent, you want to know that. Okay, third scenario. You have, this is a question I used to ask, you have a set, you want to print all subsets of that set. There are two ways of doing this. One is to, two kind of algorithm approaches. One is to print all subs, do it for the first element, then the first two elements, then the first three elements, and the first four elements. There's another approach, which is print all single element subsets, then all double element, triple, quadruple. Turns out the second approach, although it seems very, very logical, very reasonable, doesn't actually work. It's not that one couldn't, it's not that it would be incorrect if one were to do it that way. It's that actually, I've never seen that actually lead to a solution, because it's harder to print all subsets of size 7 than just all subsets in general. So first candidate takes approach 1, solves in about 15 minutes. Second candidate takes approach 2, gives up after a while, though, because it doesn't actually lead anywhere, and then switches over to approach 1 and takes about 25 minutes. What signal are you getting from each candidate?
Well, candidate 1 may have just gotten lucky.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at the possibility of, was it insight wisdom that made them take the first one, or was it just dumb one?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, they may have known the answer. They may have been dumb luck. I mean, this is where we want to separate. There's signal, and then there's who did better in some inappropriate way of assessing better, right? Yes, candidate 1 got the solution more quickly, but from a problem-solving perspective, what was going on with candidate 1 and candidate 2? Candidate 1, yes, they took the right approach. Was that just they just got lucky? Or did they have some deeper insight that made them know that this one works and this one doesn't? Candidate 2, it's kind of the inverse of that. Did they get unlucky? Or did they fail to acquire insight to realize that this doesn't work? In my experience, having asked this problem, I don't think there's much of a reason why someone takes one approach versus another. It seems to be kind of about luck or bad luck, and it doesn't seem to be that the good people take one approach versus another. I don't think it actually indicates much that someone takes the first approach versus second. It seems to be kind of random. So candidate 2 is not necessarily a worse problem solver. They just took the wrong branch. Oops. But what this also means is that when you think about it as an interview question, do you really want to be asking this question in the first place? And this is what I ultimately realized is like, wait a minute, I'm winding up. What I found is that, look, it wasn't a meaningful signal that someone took the wrong approach, but what it meant was that I had to wait for them to figure out that's the wrong approach. And that wasted time. And so then I started saying, well, let me just, if someone starts down that path, let me just like truncate that path and switch them over. And then it's just a weird experience. And I was like, this is stupid. Just don't ask this question. Like, it's making it too annoying to ask this question and making it too difficult for candidates. And so for candidate 1, signal, good problem solver. Candidate 2, basically equally good problem solver, just a little less lucky. But it's not a bad thing. For me as the interviewer, maybe just stop asking this question. Okay, so the point of all these scenarios is that I want you all to be thinking about signal. Not was the answer good or bad, did they get to the answer quickly or slowly, but what signal did you get? So these questions are about they're about challenging the candidate, making them think. You want them to solve a hard problem largely independently. But this is an ideal scenario. In reality, you may need to give some more help or less help. And the point is to hire people who are smart and adaptable and who can grow with the company, who can switch teams easily, and who can solve problems effectively. They are not trick questions. They are not brain teasers. They are definitely not ways for you to show how smart you are. Having known a solution does not make you smart. And then it's also not a test of obscure knowledge. And I want to be really, really clear about this. These questions are about designing an algorithm. They are not about knowledge of algorithms. Those are very different things. And the knowledge of algorithms, that falls into actually that knowledge section I talked about earlier. If you need someone who knows algorithms really well, go test them on that. One, be really sure that you really need that, and go test them on a lot of knowledge of algorithms if they need to know so much algorithms that you can't even train somebody on that. These questions are not about knowledge of algorithms. They're about designing your own algorithm. The other thing to know about these questions is it's not about the finish line. And even when I was new to interviewing, I would think about that I needed to get people to complete the problem. I needed to walk through this process of they come up with an algorithm, and then they optimize, and then once they get to the optimal algorithm, then they code, and then hopefully we do all this in the certain amount of time. And what I've realized later on is that that's not the point of the interview. The point of interview is for me to get signal. For these questions, it's mostly about problem solving and coding. It's getting to the finish line is not inherently important as long as I've gotten signal in those two areas. So that means that you may, particularly if you're asking them a harder problem, you may even want to warn the candidate that they may not finish the problem, especially if you're asking multiple questions in one interview. Consider warning the candidate of that. And then also think about hinting and coaching. And those can help get a better signal. And I'm going to talk about what those are. And they're actually different things. The way that I'm defining them, hinting and coaching are two different things. So being a good interviewer comes down to a couple different things. First thing is asking the right questions. So you want questions to be challenging. The point of these questions is to assess problem-solving skills. And if you're asking easy problems, you can't really do that. The difference, if you ask somebody easy problems or well-known problems, the difference between somebody who does well and someone who does poorly or solves it quickly versus slowly is very, very small, right? Like if I'm timing a race and it's from here to there, that's not really a good test of your running skills. It's too short for me to really evaluate, right? You trip and now you're an awful runner, right? You're in the bottom 10%. If I want to test how fast someone can run, I want to give a multi-mile race. I mean, it depends on what you consider as fast running, but I want to give a long race because then if you trip, yeah, that'll hurt you, but it's not going to suddenly throw you to the bottom 10% when you were actually in the top 10%. So you want challenging questions so that you can see that difference across performance. The other thing to realize is that when you ask an easy question, that actually sends a negative signal about the caliber of your company. I see candidates constantly evaluate and say, this company is better, it has better engineers because they're asking harder questions. That may not be fair entirely, but that is something that's going on in candidate mind. If you ask a bunch of easy questions, that'll result in candidates feeling like your standards are low. And understand here that that's actually incorrect from the candidate perspective. You can have really hard questions and set your bar of who you actually hire really low. And you can ask easy or medium questions, set your bar really, really high. But from the candidate's mind, they don't know where your bar is. All they hear are your questions. And when they're really easy questions, they're going to assume that that's a reflection of your actual caliber. So you do, for a variety of reasons, you do want to ask questions that are reasonably challenging. Not crazy challenging, but reasonably challenging. You want the challenges in those to come from a bunch of different hurdles. A hurdle's a key piece of optimization or insight or a follow-up, something like that. But multiple places in there where you see that candidates can tend to have to really think about the stuff. You want multiple of those for just having multiple data points. Somebody gets confused on one piece, and you can help them through that and still see how they perform in other hurdles. As much as possible, you want those hurdles to not be aha moments or tricks. So, an aha moment is something like there's that classic question about detecting a cycle in a linked list, and so you use 2 pointers. That's not something that people would logically, if you had never heard that before, and you started asking people this question, they would go through it with detecting a cycle with like, oh, maybe a hash table to record this stuff. And this idea of, oh, so now I'm going to use two pointers, that's not something that would occur to people. And if it's not something that's logically deducible, then you're not actually testing their brain, you're testing their luck. So you want things that are logically deducible as much as possible. A good rule of thumb there is if you find that there is a piece of the problem that you have a really hard time giving someone hints to get through without explicitly telling them how to get past that, then that's a sign that you can't lead them through the logic. So it's probably not particularly logically deducible. So you want them to use logically deducible as much as possible. Avoid questions that are well-known or patterns that are well-known. You're not looking at whether or not candidates are well-prepared for interviews. That's not something you should be looking for. You want candidates who are, the point of these are the candidates bright, not have they memorized a whole bunch of stuff. So avoid questions that are well known. If you have any doubt as to whether or not a question is well known, just ask the candidate, hey, if you've heard this question before, let me know. That doesn't mean all candidates will suddenly be honest, but setting that expectation up front will pretty significantly actually shift the number of people who will be up front. And if they've heard the problem before, try to move on to a different question if you can. Fundamentals. You want fundamentals of computer science to be assessed, at most, not advanced knowledge. I think my next slide shows exactly what that means. So one of the things you want to be careful of here is assumptions about what they do and don't know. Some things are very obvious to certain people. I've seen people who are like, every candidate must know about bit shifting. That is basic. And it's like, it's basic if you're a C programmer. If you're a Python person, maybe not. Like, it's not, or maybe they do know it, but they don't feel very confident in it, even though they actually do know the basic concepts. So be careful about what you think is actually kind of universal knowledge. But as a rule of thumb, if your question requires knowledge of something that you would forget within a few years of college, it's not a fundamental thing. It's a more obscure thing. And that means things like how to balance a tree, Dijkstra's algorithm, stuff like that is stuff that's very much forgettable, even for people with CS degrees. So, don't have my cheat here, but what we're talking about here is stuff that's fair game is things like arrays, hash tables, binary search trees, depth first search, breadth first search, binary search, basics, merge sort. That I'd call fundamental. Dijkstra's algorithm, red-black trees, that stuff is obscure. Yes, lots of people know it, but a whole lot more people don't know it. And if you need somebody, if you are a mapping team and you need people who are experts in graphs, and so you're telling me, actually Dijkstra's algorithm should totally be fair game for my company, then you should be saying graph stuff is so important that we are going to assess every candidate for this role on it. And it's not going to be a random thing, it's fair game or not. It's actually so important everybody gets hired on, gets assessed on this. Or it's really not that important. And actually, yes, you use Dijkstra's algorithm and this and this and this, but that's kind of it, and you can just train people on it. And that's actually often a much, much better place to go. If you're on the other side and you're saying, for our company, we don't need binary search trees, we don't need graphs, we don't need stacks and whatever, that is totally fine, actually. In fact, in a theoretically, I would love for companies just to take, for the most part, take trees and graphs and all of this stuff out of interview questions and just stick to like strings and hash tables. Because then you wouldn't rule out people who didn't feel comfortable with this stuff and just say, you know what, you need people to know it, train people on it. You can teach people in orientation on these bases of data structures if they're so important. The only reason why I don't go all the way to saying just drop this entirely is that realistically it'd be hard for people to find enough good interview questions if I didn't say trees and graphs are fair game. So it's just a nature of limited interview questions. That said, when I interview, if I'm doing genuine interviewing and not interview coaching, I don't ask questions on trees and graphs. I will ask hard questions that will limit myself to just arrays and strings and things like that. They'll still be hard, but I won't have to worry about somebody who is 20 years off their computer science degree and doesn't feel comfortable with trees. Right? It's just strings and hash tables, so better for everybody. Okay, so here's an example of a question I don't like. So implement RAND7 from RAND5. So RAND7 is a random number generator that returns a random number between 1 and 7. RAND5 is 1 and 5. So the question is, someone gives you a function for RAND5 that does RAND5. How would you use that function to then build a RAND7 function? So I don't like this question for a few different reasons. One, it's in my book, which my book is based on what questions are good for preparation, not what's good for asking. So it is my book, so that's one reason why it should be off limits off the bat. But also, it involves probability. And a lot of people are really scared about probability. Even though it doesn't require actually particularly advanced probability, they actually have the knowledge that they need to know to tackle this problem, it still scares people. And when you have candidates who get scared by a problem, you're going to have a harder time evaluating signal from that interview because they were scared and they weren't forthcoming about what they do know. So I don't like for that reason. But the bigger reason is that it's an aha moment. What happens in this interview question is candidates will spin their wheels looking for a deterministic solution. And they'll come up with this solution, it won't work, and then this thing, and it won't work. And their mind will be trapped in the zone of it has to be deterministic, meaning that there has to be some way that you can guarantee that after X calls to ran 5, then the function will be done. And that actually is actually impossible. There is no deterministic solution. This is one specific detail. If someone does not realize that there is no deterministic solution, they cannot solve the problem. They will be stuck finding a deterministic solution that does not exist. And it's a hell of a lot to rest on just one little detail. Now, if you switch it and you say, let the candidate know there's no deterministic solution, it becomes a dramatically easier problem. And that just adds so much randomness to the process. So it's not a good question from that perspective. Here's a question I do like. Given a list of people with each person's birth year and death year, find the highest population. Find the year with the highest population, well, either way. So what I like about this problem is you hear this question, and most of you probably can, if you think for 30 seconds, can come up with a solution. It'll be a brute force, it won't be perfectly optimal, fine, but you'll have something. And if you were my candidate, what I'd now do, now that you have a brute force, assuming it's correct, I'll have you go and code it. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but what that means is that you have a brute force, you've got something, you feel good. Now you go and code it right off the bat. I get that coding signal right away. And now we can spend the whole rest of the interview optimizing this thing. And I don't have to sit there and juggle the time and think, ooh, well, 10 minutes left, 15 minutes, 20 minutes left in the interview, like, she's not quite there on the optimal answer. Do I need to shift her into coding now, or do I give her another couple minutes because she's almost there? Makes it so much easier, just having you code off the bat. So much easier. And by asking this question, you never have to know trees or graphs or any of these more complex things. It's just strings, well, not strings here, hash tables, arrays, maybe sorting, really, really basic stuff. So it makes a much more reliable signal. And there's a lot of different insights along the way, a lot of different optimizations. And so it gives me a much better signal from that perspective. What I don't like about it is that it's slightly on the easier side. Great for a phone screen, though. Here's another question I like. And if you're in my coding session today, this is the question I talked about. Given two strings, S and B, find all permutations of S within B. So what I like about this is very similar to the previous thing. There are, pretty much everyone come up with a solution off the bat. That that brute force of find all the permutations of S, then search, is a little bit annoying to code, but one optimization down the road I can have you code. We get the coding piece out early, and then there's actually a couple more optimizations from there. Similar to the last problem, only involves arrays, strings, hash tables, maybe sorting. No one's going to do poorly because they don't know binary search trees or they don't feel comfortable with it. So it's great from that perspective. In this, while the previous one is a little bit on the easier side, not easy, but I'd say slightly on the easier side, this one's more on the medium to advanced level. So it's a nice sweet spot for an interview. So I really like this question. Okay, so other things about interviewing. Be nice and supportive. You want the candidate to feel good about the process. Candidates cling to every word. And you can use this to your advantage. Remember, the candidate is going to be nervous. They will cling to every word. They will be looking for signs that they're doing well or poorly constantly in the interview. So use this to your advantage. Be explicitly supportive. Make comments like, good question, interesting insight. Yep, that's exactly right. Making those little supportive comments will make a big difference in how the candidate feels about the process and also increase their confidence during the interview, which helps them do better. And then, therefore, helps you get a better signal on them. So be nice, be supportive. Third thing, coaching. So I mentioned or alluded to coaching and hints earlier. These are really, really important. Coaching, and these are different things. Coaching is stuff that is general interview advice. So it's the kind of stuff, if you're in my 215 coding talk, it's the kind of stuff I would have said there. about using examples, using a larger example, walking through your code. Don't code yet. Just take a few more minutes to figure out what you're doing. That's all coaching stuff. Please do that with your interview, with your candidates. Feel free to do that. That helps the candidates. That helps them perform at their best. Do that as much as you can, unless you're speaking up and giving advice seems to be making the candidate more nervous, which happens sometimes. Hints are things that are specific to that problem. It's comments like, what if you thought about this as a list of the number of people in every country? What if you did this specific thing? So those are hints. Coaching pretty much always gives you a better signal because it levels the playing field. It makes sure that everybody has that really good advice in the interview. Hints can give you a worse signal or a better signal. It just depends. It can give you a worse signal because by giving hints, you're depriving the candidate of the opportunity to solve something independently. Right? You don't know if they could have gotten past that piece on their own because you just helped them past it. But it can also give you a better signal because if there's 5 hurdles and they just get stuck and flounder forever on the first one, maybe that was just a little one-off and that was hard for whatever reason, but they would have done great on the next ones. So it can give you a better signal from that perspective. So you want to be sensitive to what the candidate wants. You want to look at how much time have they spent on this thing. And the way I think about hints is being increasingly specific. So I want, if there's some optimization, I want you to say, well, do this optimization. It's giving a little bit of a hint that gets a little bit closer and a little bit closer, depending on how much help they need. Increasingly specific rather than coming out right away and saying what this optimization would be. So some coaching things I do a lot are, if you're in the 215 one or you want to watch it on video, you'll see a lot of that stuff there. But suggest that they come up with examples of the input and output. Suggest that input and output is larger, that it's concrete. So if they use as their example, like array has squiggle element, squiggle element, squiggle element, dot, dot, dot. Use actual numbers, use actual words, whatever it is. If they seem to have maybe forgotten about a detail, maybe I said something like the array was sorted, and it's been 15 minutes and they haven't mentioned the word sorting, that's when I might jump in there and remind them of that, or maybe actually much earlier than that. Coding, directing when they code is another big place. I'll do it. I'll jump in and kind of direct them. So that might be that somebody states a brute force algorithm and starts coding it when I didn't want to see that. I'll stop them from coding. It is always my responsibility as the interviewer to control when they code and when they don't. That's not the candidate's fault if they're coding when they shouldn't be. It's probably, but the vast majority of the time, unless they're deliberately disobeying your instructions, that's your responsibility to control when they code and when they don't. So telling them not to code if they're using it just to explain stuff, telling them when I do want them to code. If I feel like they are rushing into coding because they feel pressure to code, but I don't feel like they actually understand what exactly they're doing, I'll stop them and have them walk through their code again, or walk through their algorithm again. Okay, next piece is evaluation. So evaluation is about signal. So it's not about, is it correct? Is it optimal? Did they complete it? These are all factors in a more qualitative sense, in that they're indicators. So yes, the more correct someone gets there, the faster they get there. These are generally things that are correlated with good performance. But the question at the end of the day is, what did I learn about them? They could have struggled for some reason that is not related to their problem-solving skills. So the question I should be asking myself is, what is that signal? So a candidate I interviewed a long time ago was very, very slow at coding. And I remember there was a bunch of discussion in the hiring committee about this person. And the question that we should have been asking ourselves was, we were having this discussion that was like about how big of a problem is it that this person was slow at coding. And well, gosh, in the real world, we need people to be reasonably fast at coding. Yeah, but they don't need to be that fast. And we kind of missed the point. What we weren't asking ourselves enough was, why was this person slow at coding? In this case, this person was slow at coding, not because they weren't smart, but because they were extremely thorough. And extremely, extremely, extremely thorough. And that's why they were so slow at coding. That in and of itself is typically a good thing. That said, in this case, the question still would have been, are they so thorough that it'll slow them down? And that will take a different kind of interview to start kind of sussing that out, and more interviews to figure out what was going on there. But we weren't asking ourselves about the signal. We weren't asking why were they slow. We're just talking about, oh, they're slow, they're not. And that's not really the point. You want to look at why was this stuff going on. So other things you want to look at in evaluation is the difficulty of the problem, how much help do they need. What you don't want to look at is confidence. And this is hard because it is really easy to perceive people who are more confident as smarter. And so but you want, be aware of this and try to ignore that piece. Look at what they really did. Confidence itself is not something you want to look at because one, it's not particularly relevant for the most part, unless you have a very particular role. But also, it lands you in a lot of potential discrimination zones. But the other thing is that people who come off confident in the interview, that might be their true behavior. It might also be that they're arrogant and on their best behavior. So that's not such a good thing. So don't look at confidence too much. Note in your evaluation that you are uncalibrated on questions early on. So the way that you're evaluating a lot of these things about how much help do they need, to take them a long time to get through quickly, these kind of things, is heavily based on other people. So on the comparison to other candidates. And so when you've just interviewed a few people on that question or nobody on that question, you don't have a lot of data to base that on. And that sucks for the candidate. But it's sort of, to some extent, a necessary evil, but you want to note that in your feedback. And just be upfront about the fact that your data point is not as reliable. It happens, but it's not as reliable. That said, there are ways of calibrating yourself. One, when you do hear a question, try to solve it independently as much as you can without looking at the answer yourself so that you know what it's like to walk through that problem. Then do look up solutions to make sure you actually have the right solution. If there's friends that you can ask the question to, I have a group of, one of the ways I calibrate myself on questions is I have a group of friends who strangely really like coding questions, and I get to bounce questions off them. And I've gotten, because I keep using the same people, I kind of have a feel for where they rank on these questions, and when so-and-so struggles with the problem, that's really hard. If this other person, if they go through it at a pretty good pace, that's actually a pretty good indicator of okay, it's on the little easier side, but doable. So have that group of people that you can ask questions to. So last thing I'm going to talk about is the actual coding piece. So in these interviews, the problem solving and the coding are very much tied together. So you ask a problem solving question and then they code. What you're looking for here is, can they translate a concept into code? Because there's some people who can't really just execute on their idea. And then to some extent, you're going to be looking at their actual coding quality. But you want to be careful here because certain things, especially when you look at people more junior in their career, certain people have awful coding style, and that's a very, very, very trainable thing. So I look at it very differently. If I see somebody who is, say, I have two candidates 3 years out of college. One is leaving Google, which has strict coding style guidelines, and the other one is leaving a startup. Both have really sloppy code. I'm going to be very concerned about the person leaving Google with sloppy code because I know that Google enforced coding style guideline. The person leaving a startup 3 years out, it's not great that they have sloppy code, but one, I know that I can enforce a style guideline at my company, and two, their startup may not have enforced that, and so that they never learned code, clean coding when they hadn't been ever taught it, that's less of a sign. So be careful about that. So when the candidate codes, it should be generally an algorithm they thought up, but it doesn't need to be the optimal algorithm. So a lot of interviewers are in this mindset of the candidate has to work through, get to the optimal answer, and then they code that thing. There's problem-solving signal, and there's coding signal. For problem-solving, that's much more about being able to get through that optimal answer. For coding signal, the optimal answer does not inherently give a more reliable coding signal than a less optimal one. In fact, I would say in most interviews, the less optimal algorithms, the brute force algorithms, often give a better coding signal because they're more structural. There's different parts to it, and there's different things you modularize. And then the optimal algorithm is like, oh, you do this neat little index increment thing, and it's like 5 lines of code. The brute force algorithm may very well give a much better coding signal. So have people code whenever you would get the best signal. Keep in mind just time management. That's easier to have them code early on and then switch back into optimizations. But focus on when you're going to get that best signal from the candidate. What you're looking for here is the signal, not was it correct or complete. So if someone's coding something and I've pretty much gotten the signal I need, I've pretty much understood their coding skills, and then there's this like stupid little method to sum an array or something like that, that's not something I'm going to have the candidate code. That's not a worthwhile thing for them to do. I'm going to let candidates skip boring things. So a whole bunch of input validation checks. I will learn something from what they thought to check, but I'm not going to learn a lot typically from having them write out 5 different input validation checks. It's a much better use of our time for me to, look if the candidate is starting to do that. If they are, just have them explain what they want to check and then just have them go on with other code. Because writing a whole bunch of null checks or whatever is not hard. And if that's hard for them, the rest of the stuff is even worse. So I don't learn much from having them do that. So think really carefully about what you actually need them to code and what you don't. When you evaluate it, what you're looking for here on a whiteboard is seemingly compilable. So relax expectations a little bit. Coding on a whiteboard is a little bit more annoying. And I am going to talk about whether you should do whiteboard or computer coding. But be really a little bit relaxed about style differences. And then relax a little bit about off by 1 errors, or little bugs. So bugs are important, meaning they're bad in the real world, but we're looking for a signal. And what I've seen is that, because I've gotten to interview the same person repeatedly, and what I've seen is that the candidate who has a flawless code one time, the next time might have 1 or 2 bugs. And then they are flawless, and that 1 or 2 bugs is just not that predictive of actual coding skills. The person who has just atrocious code, that's repeated. They just keep doing that. When you look at code and you're like, what were they thinking? That is a big, big red flag. But the difference between the like A+ code from the A- and B+ code, it's so random. Don't make too big of a deal about that. So whiteboard versus coding for computer. I'm not going to go through all of these. But what I do want to get out here, and you can pull up the slides later on and look through this, but what I do want to get out here is there are pros and cons of each. There's a lot of people who are really set on one or the other. And usually that's people who are really emphatic. It's usually really, really emphatically for computers. And so I'm going to address that. There are some major pros of using a computer. For one, it's rare to find, there's a ton of candidates and interviewers who hate whiteboards. It's rare to find a candidate who hates coding on a computer, right? And if they did, that's potentially a problem. So that's a big advantage, right? You're not going to like piss off anybody by having them code on a computer. There are a lot of people who do kind of prefer the whiteboard for interviews. It also allows you to write a lot more code that can get you better signal, assuming that code is stuff that actually gets you signal. If they're writing a lot more, if now that you have the opportunity to put them on a whiteboard, or put them on a computer, and now you're having them write a whole bunch of tedious like input parsing stuff, like that's not necessarily actually helping you at all. But there are downsides, big downsides of a computer. It's biased by what the candidate's tools are. So do they know this language, do they know the language they're working in? Is it their laptop? Is it the company's? Either way, it's weird. If it's yours, they may not be familiar with those tools, which is generally not something you should care about because that's easily trainable. If it's theirs, there's this awkwardness around like, do they hide anything embarrassing on the computer? What happens when their like friend is like, hey, how's that interview going? Have you messed it up yet? Like, there's that awkwardness, right? And then you're like creepy, like looking over their shoulders. They code a lot of times because you don't necessarily have the right stuff set up to project their screen. But one of the other big disadvantages is that if you're asking an algorithmically difficult question, you're up at the whiteboard doing this stuff, and now all of a sudden you're over here on the laptop. And it's a big mental shift there. And you don't have it's hard for you to look at the whiteboard and look at the code at the same time. And it also forces people to write code that may be more detailed than really matters. So you're asking them to write a code that happens to involve a binary search tree. And if you're on a whiteboard, you could be like, nah, okay, just assume you have some whatever binary search tree class and just make up reasonable stuff. And now on a computer, you're kind of forced in this mindset of making stuff compilable. And that ends up slowing people down in ways that doesn't necessarily help the interview a lot. So just be aware that laptops, though they have their advantages, also come with big disadvantages, especially for a more conceptually difficult problem. A whiteboard allows people to be as forgiving as you want it to be forgiving. If you want people to focus on getting every little detail right, you can do that, but you can also be really forgiving. You can say, assume that this is the way the function works. And it forces them to do also a lot more thinking. Whereas on a laptop, what I'll see often is candidates will get so focused on typing out the code really quickly that they actually stop thinking. And so whiteboard encourages a lot more thinking and makes it more collaborative as well. So I am not particularly sold on one or the other. I do lean a little bit towards whiteboards because I think it just makes things more consistent and easier for a conceptually difficult problem. But I think there's a lot of times when when computers have advantages. What I want you to take away, though, is that there are pros and cons. And be aware of what those pros and cons are so that you can mitigate those in the actual interview. And the other thing you can do is just give candidates a choice of what experience they want. But that choice should be there prior to the interview so so the candidate knows to bring their laptop and have things ready for them. Okay, so last thing I want to just remind you of is that everything's about signal. And take that back to your companies, that when people are discussing that this answer was good or bad, what is the signal? Why was this happening? The candidate was slow. Why were they slow? If they're slow because their wrist is broken, I mean, yeah, right? So focus on the signal and then focus on the candidate experience. Okay, slides again, go.gayle.com/interviewinglikeGoogle. Oh, that is actually my last slide. So I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to do my one little sales thing, which is that if you are interested in interviewer training, this is kind of a little bit of a sample from that. But I do a lot of interviewer training for bigger and smaller companies as well. Okay, questions? Yeah.
Seems like a lot of what you've presented today, the earlier session and this one, is related to like data structures and algorithms.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies, maybe it's network programming and that sort of thing. Shouldn't you ask them these questions that may be similar to the problems that you've had in your domain and present them with a challenging problem perhaps from that domain?
Yes. Absolutely. If you are interviewing specialists, then I think a lot of this concept still applies, but try to pick the problem-solving. You still want to see intelligence, but pick problem-solving questions that are relevant to that domain, rather than sticking with just data structure and algorithms. Pick something that is relevant to that domain. And a lot of the specialist positions, that's where you're going to get into a lot more knowledge questions, but you want to make sure you're really going in depth there. Sure. So it's a good question. I think they can be used for good or evil. I think that what they're really good at is, and I set them up often for companies, so I'm not by any means opposed to them. I also people use them in really bad ways. So I think where HackerRank is great is in giving a screening test that you can apply to a lot of different people and get a consistent data point on people. So it can be really useful when you want to, first of all, interview a lot more people and kind of be able to look at non-traditional candidates, but you can't necessarily justify what ends up being about 2 hours of time. And it can be really effective for that. It can be effective for if you don't have a lot of trust in your interview team, maybe because you're shifting processes, maybe a variety of reasons. It can be nice to have HackerRank in there to get that second data point. Where it goes wrong is when people think that this is going to replace their interviewing or replace a type of interviewing. So I'll see people who will try, companies who will think, that they're going to add HackerRank, and instead of doing whiteboard or laptop kind of algorithm for coding, they're just going to do it all in HackerRank. And that's wonderful until the candidates start cheating, which they will. And now you have people who basically didn't actually interview this at all. The candidate cheating is definitely something that happens. It's not, as long with HackerRank, like, and cheating doesn't mean just copy and pasting code online. I mean, they'll say that they have cheating detection things, which is true, they do. But if the point of HackerRank is to assess problem-solving skills and someone looked at the solution but implement their own thing, you didn't actually really do the interview you thought you were doing. But I think if you put it in as a screening process that happens either before or after phone interview as a second data point, I think that's great. Yes, it doesn't assess behavioral stuff. It's good at doing very particular types of things. It can't do bigger architecture things, not effectively anyway. It misses a lot of things. It's good for that one data point. But you have to be careful about how you're going to piss off candidates by doing it, especially more experienced candidates may just be unhappy about having that in their process. And that's something you have to balance. Yeah? I pretty much always advise against take-home exercises. So take-home exercises, I mean, HackerRank take-home, they're both things that you do at home for assessments, but they end up being very different in reality. So the thing with take-home projects is that the company might say this should be about a 2-hour project, but they're not like forcing you to turn it, typically, forcing you to turn it within 2 hours, right? They say, well, 2 hours about maybe, right? But if you want the job, you better be spending 10 hours, right? Yeah. And that's what happens. And I've seen this over and over again. People spend 10 hours on something. If the company asks, they're not going to say I've spent 10 hours. They're going to say, oh, 2 hours, yeah, no, right? So the company never gets this data point that they're actually wildly off on what they're asking. And so as the amount of time increases, it also becomes really unfair for people who are looking at a lot of different jobs at the same time, people who have, say, families or other commitments. And you're also, the people who are going to say, like, absolutely not, are going to be often the people who are the most skilled and the most in demand, who they're like, wait, I'm totally happy at my company. You reached out to me and you want me to now do this big homework project? No. This is not the way the game is going to be played. So you're going to lose a lot of candidates that way. And at the end of the day, the data point you're getting, there's still a lot of cheating. Right? There's still a lot of, and you can debate whether it's cheating or not, but there's still a lot of collaboration. And so you can't make that much out of what the project is the person did, because you're comparing to other candidates who might have spent very different amount of time and who might have had very different amounts of help, which also then gets back into being unfair from a diversity perspective, because diversity candidates are the ones who are least likely to be surrounded with peers who code. And so they're not going to be able to cheat as effectively. So I just think it's a bad idea for the most part. Yeah. Yeah. I would say almost always interviewers, so the question about interviewers comparing notes, I'd say almost always interviewers, you should have an expectation in your company no sharing notes. Because there's too much bias and groupthink. When somebody's like, oh, they did horribly, I can't wait to hear what you said about them. Right? Like, you're going to have a hard time being like, actually, I don't know, I think they were okay. Right? You're going to have a harder time being comfortable saying that. Admitting it as well as you're going to be biased yourself. If you need to, and generally speaking, you should have roles set up where you're measuring this thing, the other person's measuring this thing. And you probably won't generally have that much need to say, go probe on this area, because you had your role and they have their role. And if you need extra time to probe on something, like a follow-up interview can work there. That said, I think it's okay in particular situations where you have maybe 2 or 3 coding interviews and coding algorithm interviews, and you didn't get to coding, and you want to make sure the next person does. That's where it's okay to say, hey, can you make sure to do coding? But when you do that, really try not to say why. Don't say, well, the person spent so long on problem solving that we didn't get time to code, right? There's going to be, the other interviewer still going to have some questions about what was going on. But there could be many things. Maybe you were late, maybe a variety of things. So if you have to, give a specific advice, but try not to give feedback if at all possible. Just too much bias. Yeah.
So I'm interested in expanding on the coaching aspect of
Mm-hmm.
the interview. And in some aspects that you started to touch on is if someone had already read your book or
Yeah.
gone through some of the training. What about even further, like actually more probing or questioning around what you're probing for, or aspects of really trying to assist them in terms of saying that right context?
So what I recommend is, first of all, a lot of the coaching can actually be done at the very beginning of the process with the recruiters. Recruiters giving advice about here's what to expect in an interview, here's who you're going to be meeting with, or if not who, just how many interviews you're going to be doing, what types of interviews they're going to be doing. Here's what the goals of our interviewing is. Here's some advice on how to prepare. And a lot of the I'd say most of the big tech companies do things along those lines already, and putting it much more on level playing field. In the actual interview, I think you can give advice also when it's relevant, when it's useful to the candidate about here's what you're trying to get at, here's what the thing is you're trying to get to. I think that's fine to do. If it's useful to the candidate, then yeah, by all means. Yeah.
What is your take on limiting the whole interview solving a single problem, asking the few questions and then solving the problem?
So great question. Something I didn't get to otherwise. So so ask the questions about asking one question versus multiple questions in an interview. So here's the trade-off. Multiple questions is multiple data points, and that's great. Right? Someone may have messed up one question because they're scared of graphs. Multiple questions is great because it gives you multiple data points. But it comes with this other little downside about you can't ask 3 hard questions in one interview. You can't even really ask 2 hard questions in one interview, for the most part. So there's that trade-off. I'd rather people ask I'd rather people ask one fairly challenging question than 2 or 3 easy questions, right? But there is that trade-off. One way of going about this is kind of fitting a little bit of middle ground with an easier question that then has a follow-up, so you're not starting from scratch, but you're also still getting kind of a second data point. And that's another way to go about it. But yeah, it is a trade-off. I certainly do not think that you should be in a mindset of always trying to ask 2 questions. I think that shifts people to questions that are really easy and then ends up shifting, and then that ends up adding too much randomness into the process. Yeah.
Can I ask about the interview panel? So what's your thought on 45 minutes versus 1 hour slot? Obviously, you have enough time. You can ask more.
Yeah.
It's longer. And also, how many interviewers, like how many algorithms, how much design, how many behavioral, like what would be like the best practice?
Yeah. So I think for coding interviews, I think you need an hour, really. I mean, you can get away with 45 minutes, but the reality is you have a 45-minute interview, and you have 35 minutes max on the problem-solving piece, and maybe even less than that sometimes. And it becomes really hard to get things done. So I think for the algorithm interviews, you need more like an hour. But I think for lots of other interviews, you don't need an hour. I don't think for behavioral interviews, you need an hour generally. I think you're better off having 2 different people do 30-minute interviews on behavioral stuff than having one person do an hour. So I think you can change the length of time of each interview. As far as the makeup of the panel, I think it depends a little bit on the company. If you're speaking big company with lots of teams, lots of roles, a general practice is you at least want 2 coding algorithm interviews because it is a little bit less reliable of a signal. There's other things that can go wrong. So at least 2 coding algorithm interviews, plus one earlier on the phone screen. A design architecture interview typically, and a behavioral one. That's kind of the general rule. And you may add, and then in there you may also have someone do a lunch interview, which is, lunch interviews should not be interviews really. they're conversations to get to know the team. Or if you're at a bigger company, it may be in somebody off the team. You should not be looking at lunch interviews as a point of assessment. It's just, it results in the candidate not being able to actually eat. So you probably all had those interviews. So yeah, so two coding algorithms, one design, one behavioral, and then you might have another interview in there that is, for certain roles, really drilling into some specifics of that role. But then that's kind of a general practice. For certain roles, it could look a little different. And one, by the way, on that note, if you're going back to your teams, one way of setting up a process is set up that process, one big picture, kind of coding, one architecture system design kind of interview, 2 coding algorithms, 1 behavioral, and 1 interview that's the team choice. And that's a good way of giving the team some autonomy while also having a structure across the company. So behavioral should be in every interview. Every interview should start off with behavioral stuff. But the point of that first couple minutes behavioral stuff is not to actually get signal on the candidate as much as just to ease the candidate into the interview. But it should be there. Yeah, I think sometimes you can have interviews that merge the two. I think it's cleanest just to separate them. Have someone who's really diving into that. And it might be some overlap. It might be that someone asks a coding question and you have 10 minutes extra in the interview because they went through it pretty quickly, and now you talk about system design. Great. Or scaling that thing. Or you have a system design question, and they've done all the system design stuff, and that's the purpose. Like, I want interviewers to have a responsibility and to operate under the mindset that is their responsibility to get signal on. And the problem with having somebody do both of those is what is their real job? If somebody has a primary job, does that primary job, and also gets a little signal on coding, even though they're doing architecture, great. Yeah. Yeah. So you asked about ordering. I'm going to switch this into asking about also talking about cutting off candidates early. So this depends on how your company interviews. But if you're winding up in a situation, if this is a big concern, where you have candidates who are coming in and after the first interview or 2, they're just clearly not good fits, and this is happening in a significant number of cases, you should be looking at your phone interview and your screening process. That should be a very much a rarity that even happens. So you shouldn't be having to stress a lot about optimizing by removing a couple of people from the interview. And the reason why I push on that is that it pisses off candidates. When they come in, they clear off their day, they made up that excuse about the doctor's appointment, and then they're suddenly out by 10:30. And that's just, it's not a good experience for candidates. Do your job screening them. If they are not good fits in the first interview or 2, that should be very rare. And you may actually want to learn what happens in the rest of the interviews. Why did we think they were good fits in the phone interview and then they weren't? And that can actually be useful data for them. That said, there have been times where I think that you want to operate your interview process with the expectation you do not send candidates home early. Maybe you give candidates well, you're going to come in for at least 3 interviews, but maybe, maybe 4 to 5, right? But you don't want to give candidates the expectation that's one thing when a different thing happens. But I think there can be cases where you make exceptions. Operate in the mindset people are staying for the whole time, but there can be exceptions. So, I had an interview at Google where it was a situation where I was flown out to a different office to do interviews while I was setting up an office in a different country, and they literally did not screen candidates at all. They just took them all in from referrals from a professor. I had a person who I was theoretically interviewing as a software engineer who had literally never written any code in her entire life. And the policy, though, was never to send somebody home early, and I don't think that helped her at all. She didn't have the guts to walk out of the interview, and I didn't have the authority to send her home. And so we were stuck doing this interview, which she literally had never written code in her life. And situations like that should not be happening in the first place, but in those incredibly rare cases where you're clearly just pissing off the candidate by having them stay, then that may be the occasional exception to send them home. But such. Yes. Yes. And that's true for you. There's other candidates who are going to feel like they got sent home after the first interview, and that wasn't even fair. And the problem is you don't know who you're interviewing. You don't know if the candidate's going to be annoyed at having, spent the whole day clearly not a fit, or if they're going to feel like it's unfair that they were sent home after just one interview. Yeah. If you had a situation where they independently had to be a thumbs up, then sure, it makes more sense to have them do, and you're not afraid of kind of the candidate experience backlash of sending them home early, then sure. There's another side of that is one, there is this candidate experience backlash. The other piece is that even if they have to be a thumbs up, if they're a thumbs down, there can be plenty of situations where independently they would have said no, but based on the other person's feedback, they're going to say yes now. So it's not always that clear cut. I do think there is logic to what you're saying, though, and that may make sense in some companies. In general, it may not make sense. Yeah. 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 And that's the thing, is like there are many, I would say there are more candidates who get annoyed at having been sent home early than candidates who get annoyed at having stayed the whole day. Part of that's because the candidate who stayed the whole day, even though they clearly weren't a fit, they didn't know that, right? So they can't get quite as pissed off about it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so over the phone, so one is focus on what you can and can't do. You can do behavioral questions over the phone. You can do coding questions over the phone. You can't do system design over the phone. Just deal with the fact that you just can't screen for this. I mean, you can do a little bit in the context of behavioral questions when you talk a little about how they design some system, but you can't really, so just don't try to have them design some brand new system over the phone, because it's just so hard to do that. For coding interviews, HackerRank is a good tool. There's a variety of tools to do online coding. Do not use Google Docs. It's not set up for coding. There are coding tools for this. Use those. HackerRank is a good tool. All you really need is something that has fixed width fonts and really simultaneous coding, so that it's not like a 2-second delay. HackerRank is great. I use HackerRank mostly, but there's other things for that. Am I getting? Yeah. Okay. I'll be outside.